From the shortage of available housing to the high private sector rents, Scotland finds itself in an alarming situation. Nearly 250,000 Scots are stuck on waiting lists for a social home. And amid mounting pressures in homelessness services, 3 Scottish councils have declared housing emergencies. Other local authorities are warning they will be next. Vanessa Taff has been investigating the scale of the crisis.
There are 66 steps to and from Kirsty's front door, but they leave her physically exhausted, struggling to breathe.
I've left the house once this year on the 6th of January. You just feel so alone and desperate.
Living with a chronic illness, Kirsty's home in Edinburgh isn't suitable for her medical needs. And she's just been told the waiting list for a new one is 10 years.
You know, my initial thought was I'll probably be dead by then. I don't know what to do. I was gobsmacked. 10 years. I can't handle it. And not being able to go outside and meet friends, not be able to just go for a walk to the garden to feed the birds. And the isolation. Yeah, just the difficulty in the kind of keeping yourself together altogether, you know, the what's the point?
Under the current criteria, Kirsty isn't considered to be in housing need.
It was very, very soul-destroying, given that I thought I got my point across as to how unwell I was, the medical evidence that's there. There was no information on the email whatsoever about ability to appeal this, or who can I contact to challenge the fact that I've been assessed as a mover when I cannot breathe.
Edinburgh is one of 3 council areas that have declared a housing emergency, meaning there aren't enough suitable, stable homes. The latest report shows almost 700,000 families in Scotland are in housing need. That's more than official Scottish Government figures have accounted for, as current methods only include those in acute need, not those like Kirsty, who are in an unfit property.
The definition of need has become stricter and stricter. You can argue about, a hierarchy of needs, starting with those that are homeless or in temporary accommodation, down to maybe single young adults who are living with their parents, but who want to leave home. So you can argue that there's a hierarchy of need, but there is still that need that needs to be accounted for in official figures.
The housing budget has been cut by £200 million for this year and next, putting affordable solutions to the housing crisis in doubt. Since our filming, Edinburgh Council have reviewed Kirsty's circumstances. She's been told she's now on a priority list, but that move is likely to take quite some time.
So, can the Scottish Government be doing more to address this crisis? We spoke to Holyrood's Housing Minister, Paul McLennan. Minister, Shelter have today accused the Scottish Government of not taking the issue of homelessness seriously enough. Are they right?
No, I meet with Shelter on a regular basis. I've met with Shelter on probably a dozen times since I've been in post, so I would refute that, and I'll continue to meet Shelter to discuss.
But if you're meeting them and they're saying you're not taking it seriously enough, it's not about meetings, it's surely what comes out of these meetings.
Of course it is, and I think one of the important things, John, is the context that we're in. We've had our capital budget cut by 10%, and I think when you look at the impact of COVID, of Brexit, of cost of living, construction costs and so on, that's had an impact. I meet with Shelter and other stakeholders on a regular basis, and obviously look to work with them as closely as we possibly can. And I know you've got Jane Wood coming on later on, and I just met Jane, for example, a few times last week to talk about some of the issues that they've raised, and work very closely with them. I meet with local authorities on a regular basis. But what we're hearing,
it's OK, you're maybe meeting with them, but what we're hearing is you're not listening and nothing is changing. For example, in the budget that's going through Parliament just now, the Scottish Government is proposing a £196 million cut from the affordable housing programme. That's not taking it seriously, is it?
John, that's the capital budget. That's a draft at the moment, and I think in the context of coming back to the capital cut that I talked about, it's not just ourselves that are saying that. The Welsh Government has said that this was the most difficult budget they've faced in the devolutionary era. So it's not just the Scottish Government that's facing this problem, it's the Welsh Government, for example, as well. It's also the government cuts to public services in the UK, and we have the UK budget coming up, and there's a number of asks for myself. They should, restore the capital budget cut to ourselves. Local housing rates need to go back up to where they were in terms of that. So
but these are choices. This is a devolved issue. These are choices you can make. We hear that the Fraser of Allender Institute, for example, says that the budget for the affordable housing in Scotland has been cut by more than a third in just 2 years. Again, is that taking it seriously?
Yeah, yes. I mean, again, it comes back to the context that we're in. We're facing a 10% capital cut. That equates to £1.4 billion. I'm not in the same position as a minister, a housing minister in any other country in Europe. They have the ability to go borrow more funds to try and build a house. But I don't have that luxury. I have to work with the capital that we're given by the UK government. They've cut that budget by 10%. We'll try to make that
if that is the position we're in, what can you offer homeless people? What can you say to them to give them any encouragement?
I think there's a number of important things, John, in terms of that. We built 40%, have done since 2007, 40% more head population than England and 70% more head population than Wales. And just in July this year, I met in Fife with the First Minister, and we discussed and mentioned about the acquisition policy, making £60 million forward to buy more properties. Now, that fund, we are in discussions obviously with key local authorities, and that fund will be spent. And we also talked around about allocation policies that push the homelessness people further up the line in terms of that. And I meet with Edinburgh and Glasgow and other local authorities on a regular basis to see what we can do. For example, around about empty homes, how can we assist them in dealing with that? Around about the allocations that we've talked about, the acquisitions funding that was announced last year has made a difference. These
are some of the things you're talking about, but 250,000 people are in social housing, on the social housing waiting list. How did it ever come to that?
I think that it's been over a number of years, and one of the key things that we've had to do.
But you've been in power for 15.
Yeah, over a number of years, and I think one of the key things, again, it comes back to the context around about the capital spending that we don't have. I would love to borrow more funds to go out and build more council houses. I don't have the luxury to do that.
As I repeat that, 250,000 people on the waiting list. And you've been in power since 2007. I got my arithmetic wrong. That's actually what we're coming up for 16 and a half years. So,
John, I acknowledge that we are in a tricky position at the moment. But I think one of the key things is when you come back and talk about homelessness, there was a report out from about the homeless monitor, and this was by Heriot-Watt University. They mentioned the biggest barrier at the moment in reducing homelessness was in terms of the local housing allowance rates, which has been frozen for a number of years by the Conservative government. So, and they also mentioned about the cuts, for example, in welfare, which has made a big difference. We also mitigate £90 million a year on discretionary housing payments because of the two-child cap, because of the bedroom tax. Now, the UK government could raise that. An incoming Labour government could change that as well. That's another £100 million could go to that.
So the major problems then, as far as you're concerned, stem from the UK government. The fact that it's a devolved issue, and you've been in power since 2007, and we've got these problems. It's still the UK government to blame. Is that what you're saying?
John, I accept responsibility. We need to be building more houses. However, the capital budget cut of the 10%, it makes a major impact on that. And the level of local housing allowance makes a major impact on that. Even though it's a devolved issue, there are many issues that are still controlled. For example, around about our capital borrowing powers, around about local housing allowance rates, around about what we can do. Okay. These are still controlled by the UK government. Now, any UK government that comes in after this election, be it Conservative or Tory, there's a challenge. Restore the capital budget cut, restore local housing rates to where they need to be. And if we've seen that, then obviously we'd be spending more money and give us borrowing powers to borrow more money to build more houses more quickly.
Very finally then, Minister, you saw the report and you saw the story of Kirsty. What hope can you offer her?
John, my background's 15 years as a councillor, and housing and homelessness was always the biggest issue we've had. Now, I'm glad that Edinburgh have picked it up in terms of that. In terms of when I was in East Lothian Council, there was always points for health issues, and I'm glad Edinburgh have now picked it up. So she should be getting further up the line in terms of that. In terms of acquisition policies, that's allowing us to go out and build, to buy more houses as quickly as we possibly can. That policy, as I said, we're liaising with Edinburgh Council, amongst others, in terms of that. Now, if we buy these houses, they'll come forward as quickly as we can. And we're working in Edinburgh in terms of empty houses and allocations to try and bring as many houses into the system as we quickly can.
Paul McLeod, thanks for joining us in Scotland Tonight. For another perspective, we were joined by Jane Wood, the Chief Executive of Homes for Scotland, which represents the house building industry. Jane, you've just heard what the Housing Minister had to say. What's your reaction to it?
Well, I think first of all I welcomed his acknowledgement that we need more houses in Scotland. I think I have to say that Scotland's population deserves better than blaming it all on Westminster. I don't think that's fair or right. The housing, we're in a housing crisis. It's been building up since 2008. You know, we've got 100,000 deficit in houses. We've got a 41% drop in housing starts. You know, all of the data that we're creating, none of it is telling us that we're dealing with the problem. And it's a devolved issue as well.
Why is that, do you think?
Look, housing's very complex. It's got a lot of diverse stakeholders. It's easy to blame government, but whatever solution it is, it has to be across private and public sector. We need to talk all tenure because it's all interlinked. But I think at the basic, if we all think about housing as a human right, we start with that premise, and then we look at where the solutions lie in terms of what are the actual barriers, and planning is obviously a barrier. Housing policy is not a priority in the Scottish Government. It wasn't in the programme for government. It sits over here, and it needs to be cross-directorate because our national outcomes in Scotland, housing impacts every one of them, educational attainment, you know, well-being, everything. And I think that if we can look at it with a systemic approach to it, and then we can break down the barriers. But at the moment, it's just in silos and nobody's finding the solutions. And I think
what sort of solutions would you be thinking of? Give us an idea of what.
I think they've got to be short term. I think because it's immediate. You know, I think you mentioned in your report, 3 local authorities now announcing housing emergencies. We are in a crisis. We're not delivering the houses that the Scottish population needs, and that's private, affordable and sociable. I think that if it was a solution, and I've discussed this with government, I think planning needs to have an immediate solution. It needs resource. They've cut that in the draft Scottish budget as well. I think if they can get some resource into the planning system and exemptions on those planning applications that are going to delay large numbers of houses being built in rural and urban, conurbations, that's one solution. But I think they need to look at data. They need to look at the policies that they're creating. It's a heavily regulated industry sector, and if they can look at how those policies are creating some of the unintended consequences, and those are normally reducing housing supply, and just acknowledge that we're in a very difficult economic arena at the moment as well, and this is a fragile industry. We saw that with Stuart Milne. The small and medium builders really struggling.
Just very briefly and finally, if there have been calls for a national emergency plan, we've heard that 3 local authorities have declared emergencies. Would a national emergency plan work? How would it work? Briefly, I know it's a complex question.
Well, I don't want to talk about bureaucracy at this stage, but it would absolutely depend in terms of how honest that we were being about what the problem is. And I think that's half the problem. It's always political. There will be some defensiveness. If we could just be honest about what the problem is, what the barriers are, the solutions are there, but it needs collaboration across industry and government, and it needs government to use data and evidence better.
Jane Wood, thanks for joining us in Scotland tonight.